Hey everybody, Matt Michaels here with DJ Impact. And today I'm going to hand it over to DJ Impact to do the setup because this is going to be primarily DJ's pride and joy. This baby that of an interview that he found he's cultivating himself here. So, DJ, with that, why don't you introduce a person I'm so glad we have an opportunity to talk to, and I'm so excited to get a chance to hopefully help boost a very important film that's coming out here right now. And DJ, go ahead, man.
Yeah, listen, it's February, which means it's Black History Month, and we're starting our third year in our podcasting. We have yet to put a focus on Black history, and I thought, why not do a couple of episodes or so, just highlighting and learning about African American women in this case, pro wrestlers. And the reality is I know absolutely nothing historically on this topic. And because of that, I got our writer and filmmaker, Chris Bournae, with us. Hey, Chris.
Hey, DJ Impact and Matt. I appreciate you guys having me on. I really appreciate you bringing awareness to this story.
Absolutely. You know, Matt and I, and we'll talk later on to see if you're caught up with any of the current wrestling programs and everything that's happening, but we're huge wrestling fans. And I could tell you, speaking for myself, when Bianca Belair won the Women's Royal Rumble that happened in January, it was very exciting to see that again. An African-American woman who is going to be a future champion is going to hold that title for a while. At the same time, we have Sasha Banks, who is the current Women's SmackDown champion. Again, another African-American woman who is holding it down in wrestling. In Impact Wrestling, you have Kiera Hogan and Tasha Steelz as the Impact Women's Knockout Tag Team Champions, which I tried to research. Was there any women tag team in the mainstream promotions, in the big promotions, that has ever had that role? I couldn't find it, and I'm shocked that Impact Wrestling wasn't really making a big deal out of it. But to me, it was important to see that. So I guess I wanted to ask you, Chris, just starting off. I with all of this hype that was going on, I said, look, I'm just curious, who was the very first African American woman who was documented in pro wrestling? And doing that, I found Ethel Johnson's name that came up on Wiki. So the question I'll start off with you is that correct? Is Ethel Johnson, is it documented that she is the very first Black pro wrestler?
Well, Ethel is, I would say, the first like major superstar in what you would call modern day pro wrestling, which started in the 30s. We don't think of the 30s as modern day, but I'm talking about before, women used to wrestle in circus sideshows and carnivals. So
okay,
the modern day industry, Ethel was the first superstar. But interestingly enough, Ethel's older sister Babs was actually the first Black woman recruited into pro wrestling by the promoter Billy Wolf, who started a women's wrestling enterprise to find competitors for his wife, Mildred Burke, it was like one of those stories where he plucked Mildred Burke, who was white, and Billy Wolf was white, out of obscurity and decided, okay, I'm going to turn my wife into a wrestling star. She needs women to compete with. And Billy Wolf, although he had a reputation as being kind of shady, like he would underpay his wrestlers and, he was a womanizer. He wasn't faithful to Mildred by all accounts. But one of his redeeming qualities was he was progressive on racial issues, and he was inspired by Jackie Robinson. And he thought, if I can do for women's wrestling what Jackie Robinson did for Major League Baseball by recruiting Black women, then it'll bring a lot of attention to the sport, which it did. So he first recruited Babs, and then through Babs, Ethel got involved, and their younger sister Marva got involved. So it was these three sisters, Babs, Ethel, and Marva.
Awesome sisters. And when they wrestled, did people even know that they were sisters at the time?
No, and Billy Wolf intentionally gave them different because the family name was Wingo. So Babs Wingo had the family name since she started. And then Billy Wolf gave them different ring names because he didn't want the fans to know they were sisters, because he didn't want to think, okay, if they're all in a big match together, they're going to take it easy on each other because they're sisters. So he kept that, he made sure that he kept that illusion up. And actually a wrestling fan named Kenny Clark, who I interviewed in the documentary, said, I was a big fan of Ethel and I saw her wrestle her sisters, not knowing they were her sisters. So that was definitely part of the, the mystique, is keeping her and her sister's identities separate.
How difficult was it for these ladies to be in an industry that, of course, is dominated by white men? And, even at the same time, and I could be even wrong on this, but I would even think that in the times, back in the 50s or so, I would assume that women have sort of an idea of what a woman should be, and not just from white men, but just black men, people in general, who just have this idea of what black women should be doing. And wrestling, I would think, would not be it. So how difficult was it for them to, have this career that they decide to take in?
Right. Well, Ethel talks about that in the documentary. She talks about how she and her sisters, and they started when they were very young. Babs was a teenager. Ethel was like 12. So I mean, they were really, really young. So on the one hand, it's like they had this naivete, like they didn't know anything different. And Ethel talks about how their brothers would teach them to, they would all play together, and her brothers would make these makeshift weights with cement blocks and teach them how to lift weights. And they would go to tumbling classes. They took gymnastics, not knowing it would later pay off in the wrestling ring. So on the one hand, the Wingo sisters were tomboys, and then it just by chance it paid off in a wrestling career. But it's sort of like they knew that, it was supposed, the old saying, girls are full of sugar and spice and everything nice. Right. Of course they knew that, because that's everything that surrounded them. Women in dresses, and women were not, there were a few maybe track stars, but there weren't wrestling stars. So on the one hand, they knew it was unusual. On the other hand, they were so young that they really didn't know any different. And it wasn't strange. It was just like, okay, my sister is trying this new thing. I'm going to go hang out at the gym and see what comes of it. But they had a lot of really, I think their race was more of a negative than their gender was, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm sure that reminds me, because you did say documentary. I want everyone to know that your new film, Lady Wrestler, the amazing untold story of African-American women in the ring, is available on Amazon Prime. So please, everybody, I know you have Amazon, because Jeff Bezos, he got so much money right now. He stepped down so he can go make more. Okay. So I know you
thanks
got
for the plug. I appreciate it.
Yes, absolutely. Excited to see. Promotions, companies at that time, were they in a particular promotion specifically that they were in, or were they just doing these events on the side?
Well, so Billy Wolf was from Missouri. He was a kind of a failed wrestler himself. And he settled in Columbus, Ohio, which is my hometown, which is how I got involved in the story. And I never found the reason why he chose Columbus. I happen to think it's because Columbus is known as a logistics hub. Columbus is in the Midwest, and it's within a day's drive of something like 75% or 80% of the country, something like that. So it may have been that Billy Wolf knew he could, because back then airplane travel wasn't all that common. He knew that he could send his wrestlers driving to different parts of the country with, it would only take them a day or so to get to the match. So Billy Wolf teamed up with another promoter named Al Haft, who was also based in Columbus. Al Haft was a member in good standing of the National Wrestling Alliance. And I'm getting these details from a book called Queen of the Ring by Jeff Lean, who's a Washington Post reporter who wrote a biography, the biography Queen of the Ring, about Mildred Burke. So between Billy Wolf and Al Haft, they were sort of the kingpins of women's wrestling. And Al, through his connections with the National Wrestling Alliance, were able to book all these women, not just in the United States, but all over the world. We're talking Latin America, Japan, Australia, Canada. So yeah, it was they sort of formed their own organization.
And there was an audience that really came out to support these women as well. I mean, this was pretty big during that time.
Yeah, and this was when, of course, television was just starting. So
Mhm.
some of the people I interviewed said, "Oh, I remember seeing some of these." There was like a local in Columbus television show called The Lex Mayer Show. One of the wrestlers I interviewed, Ramona Isbell, who was a peer of Ethel and her sisters, talked about seeing wrestling on TV before she actually became a wrestler.
Mm.
But Billy knew it would be like a novelty thing. Like not only was it a novelty seeing women wrestling in the first place, but seeing Black women wrestling white women, seeing women on the same cards as men. Billy knew it would be like this sort of sensational thing that would bring people out of sheer curiosity. Like, what are these Black girls doing up here with these,
Right.
famous white men? Why are they on the same card? And so that it brought attention, but it also brought complications because Ethel talks about
Mhm.
different times where they had to go wrestle in the South. And the promoters were like, you were going to do one show for the white audience and a separate show for the Black audience because we are not having any race mixing, in our auditorium. And
Wow.
you hear old Motown stars talk about that, about how
Sure.
you have to do these separate shows, or the Black people would be way up in the balcony, for the quote unquote colored section.
Yeah.
So Ethel and her sisters were kind of pioneers in that area because Ethel at one point told one of the promoters, "Look, if you don't let Black people in, I'm not wrestling because I'm Black." So she ended up just forfeiting her purse and leaving and going home and not even wrestling because she got sick of
Yeah.
having to. It was really, a lot of it was just being physically tired, kind of like how Rosa Parks said, "I was just
Right.
tired. I didn't feel like standing up." It was like Ethel was physically tired of doing two matches each time she went to her city, one for each segregated audience. And it was like, I'm tired of this.
Right.
There's no reason why you shouldn't let Black fans and white fans sit in the same auditorium. So she had no intention on being a civil rights pioneer,
Right.
but her actions sort of resulted in the promoters relenting and saying, okay, we'll let everybody of different races come in and watch the same match.
Well, in that vein,
Mhm.
how profitable was the added attraction of having African American women on the card for these promoters? And you would think with that mentality in the South, were the audiences drawn out of the sheer curiosity, or were they drawn out of the fact that, like, if you had a Black audience and a white audience and you had the separate audiences, was there more heat from a white audience, or was there more like revelation from a Black audience, where you're trying to mix the two eventually, but as standalones, did it bring more gate by having the curiosity of the white, you know, racists, or the white people who maybe never got a chance to interact with Black people,
Mhm.
to see them wrestle on the same card with, wrestlers who they might know?
Yeah, I think that's what Billy Wolf and Al Half banked on, was it the curiosity factor and the sensationalism. In fact, if you look at some of the old posters, and I show some of these posters in the documentary, one poster that really stands out is this poster that Ethel's on that says "Negro gal, real crowd pleaser." So it's almost, I hate to keep using this analogy, but it was almost like a circus attraction. Like, come see the two-headed,
Mhm.
you know, circus oddity or whatever. So it was like they were banking on white audiences being like, I can't see this on TV. I can't see this in the movies. One of the famous stories Lena Horne always told was that her scene where she sings "Stormy Weather" was cut out of I think it was the movie Cabin Fever when it played in the South. So white audiences didn't even see Black actors except for maybe something like Gone with the Wind, where it was totally stereotypical on the big screen or on television. They didn't see race mixing. So it was like this curious, sensational, wow, let me just go check this out kind of thing. And like you said, for Black audiences, it was like, wow, these women are super cool. They're like heroines. I can't believe they're up here on this
Right.
card, white men, or I can't believe. Actually, Ethel's older sister Babs did the first interracial championship with Mildred, Billy Wolf's wife. So they made a big deal out of that, like, oh, come see this interracial championship. So sort of like it was like a moneymaker, but it was also a liability because Ethel told stories in the documentary about there were at least a couple times when a group called the White Citizens Council, which was a form of the Ku Klux Klan, threatened them and said, "We are going to hang you if you let those Black girls on the mat. We are going to hang them." And they had to like leave, in terror and not even wrestle. So
Wow.
yeah, it was sensationalism, but you were taking a big risk at the same time. But it was sort of like, well, that's the risk we'll take if we can, make more money by having these interracial matches.
When they did have those matches, how did it go? I mean, I'm assuming that sometimes maybe Ethel and her sisters won the match against
Right.
Mildred. How was that accepted when that happened versus when it's the other way?
Right. I don't know the details of like
Sure.
all the all who won all the matches, but my suspicion is that when it was an interracial match, the
Right.
white person had to come out on top because
That's
look
what
at
I was
like
thinking.
how
Mhm,
look at how someone like Jack Johnson, I mean, he really got harassed because
mhm.
he defeated white opponents. So it was
Right.
they would play up the interracial aspect, but they would only go so far.
I
They
understand.
wouldn't have Black people as like,
Sure.
oh, look at these champions that defeated their white opponents. I don't think it was like that. It was like
Absolutely.
more like, oh, come see these people that you'd never see in the same place ever in life
Mhm.
wrestling, and proving that, oh, though the white person, yes, they're proving their superiority. So a lot of it was just kind of reinforcing, unfortunately, the perception of white superiority in a lot of the times.
With Mildred Burke and Billy Wolf, I've always heard basically that the answer to that question is that even the white opponents would lose to Mildred because he was protecting her essentially. She was his meal ticket.
Yes.
At the same time, the even the white women would be kind of shortcut pay by Billy. He wasn't the nicest man with the pocketbooks. Was there any revelation about how much the women would make at that time? Was it peanuts compared to um, what they realistically should have been getting for full houses as compared to what they probably got, which I could only assume was just not very enticing, knowing the stories about just how he was a real tightwad with paying out the women.
Yeah, I believe in Jeff Lean's book, he said it could be as low as like $50 to maybe up to 500 or more if it was like a really big match. But a lot of times, even if you were promised a certain purse, then like you said, Billy Wolf would find ways to weasel out of pay what he owed the women. Or one of the wrestlers, I interviewed Ethel Brown, a white woman who was also a peer of the Wingo sisters, and she said that Billy Wolf liked to play. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. This was Jeff Lean, another story. Jeff Lean. He said that Billy Wolf would challenge the women to like these card games, like let's play poker. And of course, Billy Wolf would, the house always wins. So Billy Wolf would end up cheating them out of their earnings. And why, it makes you wonder why would they fall for that? But
Right.
maybe they realize, okay, I kind of have to play along in order to stay employed by him. So maybe I won't get exactly what I'm owed, but maybe the women, just like the stardom, and they were making more money than if they worked as a waitress or the menial jobs that women could get at that time if you didn't have some kind of advanced degree.
Another question regarding the operation that he was running.
Mhm.
Did they do did they have a house on site where the women lived?
No, that it wasn't like what's her name, Moolah, Fabulous
No.
Moolah, when she got into wrestling. Because Fabulous Moolah, I'm sure as you know, was one of Billy Wolf's wrestlers before she broke off and formed her own organization. But it wasn't like this. I hate to use this word, plantation, where he kept the women in like a live-in facility. The women, since most of the women were from Columbus, they had their own homes, and some of the women, like by the time they came of age, got married and had families. Like Ethel talks about that a lot, about how she didn't tell her family she was a wrestler. So it wasn't like this all-inclusive live-in facility. He had training gyms. Both Billy Wolf had a training gym downtown, and then Al Haft had a training gym in a suburb called Reynoldsburg. But it wasn't, to my knowledge, like a live-in place where the women were housed there. Like maybe at first, maybe if someone came in from out of town, Billy Wolf would put them up someplace because he had his office in this place called the Park Hotel in downtown Columbus. But it wasn't, you know, he didn't have some big sprawling estate where he housed everyone at like Moolah did.
What was it like for the women who were getting into the business in terms of the ages? I know you said that you know, as young as 12 years old. At that time, was there a process of getting around having, you know, younger women perform on the show?
Yeah, I mean, back then, child labor laws were really lax. I mean, if you look at Hollywood back then, Elizabeth Taylor and Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney, they were all worked, you know, 20 hours a day making those musicals and stuff. So child labor laws were not very enforced very well. So wrestling back then, I don't know how it is now, wrestling was not very well regulated. And the National Wrestling Alliance was not going to swoop in and say, oh, you have this 12-year-old girl training for hours and hours, and oh, we're going to fine you because we want you to have, you know, stellar business practices. I just think it was an unregulated industry. It was kind of like the Wild West, and it was sort of like anything goes. So I don't think it was a problem at all that they were working these minors, or even, you know, even some of the girls were over 18. It was like whatever it took for them to get up to snuff in Billy Wolf's eyes. That's what it took. And it was like, okay, this is the breaks. Either you accept it or leave.
Right.
With that, my next question is, I know that when Moolah started, she got like, I think it was Jungle Girl or something like that. It was, you know, something like an exotic type of gimmick, that, you know, she was basically the corner woman for a wrestler. Was there a tendency to use like any kind of like African themes towards the wrestlers, or was it, you know, basically straight up, you know, hey, you're from Kansas City, and you know, you're you know, whatever, you know, more of an everyday person, as opposed to giving like these exotic, like, hey, come see, you know, so and so because she's like the wild woman of, you know, the dark jungles or something. Yeah.
Yeah,
What
those
was it?
stereotypes definitely existed in that era. There was one woman who went by the stage name the African Princess, and there was another one named the African Pussycat. I don't know if they were managed by Billy Wolf. To my knowledge, the Black women that Billy Wolf managed were just straightforward. It's like he didn't want from what the women told me, he didn't want weird, kind of exotic, strange stuff. He wanted a Hollywood glamour image. So he came up with this formula called Sex, Muscles, and Diamonds. Jeff Lean goes into in depth in this in his book. Billy Wolf and Mildred Burke developed this formula called Sex, Muscles, and Diamonds, where the women had to have sex appeal, they had to have muscles, be real athletes, know all the holds. They couldn't just get up there and be a pretty face without knowing what they were doing. They really, really had to know what they were doing in the ring. And they had the diamonds was the glamour image. So he wanted women who looked like they could be Hollywood starlets when they weren't in the ring. They weren't allowed to wear pants or slacks, as they called them back then, outside the ring. They weren't allowed to smoke cigarettes or use profanity. They had to look like models. So he wasn't into all those, even though he promoted them sort of like circus oddities, like Negro Gal, you know, a crowd pleaser. He didn't want the sort of savage element of it, because he didn't see that as ladylike, at least from my understanding of it.
You know, so going back to, to Ethel and her sisters, was there ever a time where they, as they were wrestling, they became very popular? I mean, even to the point where maybe they even held a belt, a championship of some sort of?
Yeah, they were very popular. I don't know specifically what belts they held, but I know Ethel was even Ramona, the other wrestler I interviewed, she said Ethel was considered the top black star of her day. I found tons of newspaper clippings and clippings from wrestling magazines at the University of Notre Dame, which has this huge wrestling archive, where it was like Ebony Beauty, she has ferocity and beauty. I mean, Ethel really was celebrated like someone like Venus or Serena Williams in her day.
Mm.
They were really known not just in the States, but internationally. Ethel had a ring name in Latin America, Rita Valdez. So she went to Cuba before the embargo. She went to Mexico. She was very popular in Canada. Marva, her youngest sister, wrestled a lot in Japan and Australia. And Ramona talks about going to different matches in Australia. So these women they were very popular internationally, not just stateside, but yes. And unfortunately, because a lot of the black women, for their own personal reasons, they felt kind of a shame and a stigma about it. They felt it like wasn't a quote unquote real job. So a lot of black women didn't talk about their jobs outside when they weren't in the ring. It was like, I'm home being a quote unquote normal person, a wife and a mother. And then wrestling is just something I do. It's kind of like a way to make money, something they enjoyed, and they enjoyed the fame aspect of it, but they really kind of kept it quiet when they were home, which is why this story has been kind of underground for so many years, because the women themselves didn't talk about it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that is, yeah, go ahead, man. That's the thing that I find interesting is why isn't their names out there?
Yeah.
And it's just, you know, I mean, even right now, as much as we're watching, when I watch WWE and they run their sort of Black History prop, they've given props and videos that they're running. Um, they talk about those that wrestle in WWE or maybe in one of the territories, but you never hear any of the African American women. They rarely ever get acknowledged from that time, that time era, of there. And then so and down finding this out, you're going, why are they being left out? So that's why I'm very happy you did the research into finding this information.
Thank you. Yeah, and so it blew my mind when I found out about these women, because I grew up in the city where this whole enterprise started. And my first job, most of my career has been in print journalism. My first couple of jobs were at Black newspapers. Never, I'm saying never, did anyone ever mention to me, oh, there used to be famous Black women wrestlers in town. They were never, ever, ever brought up. Part of it, as I said, the women themselves, they wanted complete privacy when they weren't out of the ring. And then when they weren't wrestling, they just wanted to be normal, everyday wives and mothers. And then after they retired, they weren't going around like Moolah and saying, oh, look what I did, and put me in a Hall of Fame.
Right.
I first wrote about these women for the Columbus Dispatch, the local daily newspaper. And Arnold Schwarzenegger holds a fitness festival in Columbus every year because he won one of his first bodybuilding titles in Columbus. So he comes back and holds this fitness festival every year. So when the article came out, Arnold Schwarzenegger's people called me and said, we want to give Ethel Johnson a Lifetime Achievement Award. Ethel turned it down. So there were some gestures from people. Even some wrestling organizations had approached Ethel and some of the other Black women about inducting them into halls of fame.
Yeah.
And a few of them, like Princess Jasmine, have been recognized, but so many of the women, either through, this mindset, I'm retired, I don't want to talk about my past, because they've had a lot of painful experiences with racism and sexism, or the industry itself just deciding, Mildred Burke hasn't even gotten the credit that she deserves, and she's a white woman who was married to the man who started it all. If she didn't get her proper credit, then what are Black women who are shy and skittish about talking about it, how are they going to be recognized? And I hate to say this, I don't mean any disrespect to wrestling, but I think part of it is some people look down their nose at wrestling and think, oh, this is fake, and I'm not going to recognize the people who were instrumental in the early days of wrestling. We have a bridge in the historic Black part of town in Columbus, where a lot of the Black community leaders they have a mural with the image of a lot of the Black community leaders. And I feel like Ethel, if no one else, Ethel should be on that bridge. But I sort of feel like it's kind of an uphill battle to get her on that bridge because of people's perceptions of wrestling. Whereas if she was Althea Gibson or Florence Griffith Joyner in a quote unquote legitimate sport, it would be way, way easier. It's just because people have these perceptions of wrestling as not being quote unquote real, which I think they need to get over themselves.
Right.
But there's all kinds of interest in these women. Every time I tell somebody about it, I'm talking about like from academia. I've lectured at Ohio State, my alma mater. Every time, so universities from around the world have contacted me and said, we're really interested in these women's stories. So it's not for lack of interest among the public. It's just some of the gatekeepers who would be the ones to honor these women haven't stepped up to the plate and said, we really need to erect the statue of Ethel Johnson. We have a statue of Arnold Schwarzenegger in downtown Columbus, who I love Arnold. He's done a lot for Columbus. He's not from Columbus. He doesn't live here. Ethel Johnson was born, raised, and lived her entire life in Columbus. There's no statue of Ethel Johnson or even a street named after her.
Wow.
I think that when you look at the history of wrestling, one of the reasons that we don't see as much recognition is because women wrestling in general basically got wiped out in a very important part, and that was from the early 70s until Vince McMahon really started taking over in the 80s. And Moolah was the only one that really they surfaced back up because she had a reputation and a working relationship with Vince. And then they tried promoting Wendy Richter, and you saw a little flirtation with women wrestling that never got anywhere past having a champion or two show up, occasionally bringing in a couple Japanese wrestlers, but you didn't see any African American wrestlers as far as women until Glow. And that's a huge time period. And between kind of that generation of the 50s, early 60s until the mid 80s, late 80s. On top of that, there isn't a lot of wrestling footage that remains because a lot of the television programs back then weren't filmed onto tape. So it's almost like it was easy because like something like baseball or basketball, sporting events, you had actual, whether it be cameras there, movie cameras, or some kind of video or some kind of audio, if it was a radio broadcast. Whereas wrestling, it just like it disappeared for African American women until Glow, a cheesy, television show in the 80s shows up. And now you can kind of start seeing, if you're a young kid, hey, there's someone who looks like me that is performing on TV and she looks like a superhero. How important is that in terms of that next step to start building the next generation of wrestlers who were African American in the late 90s and early 2000s, which eventually would then kind of start the ball rolling to where we are now? Is it something that as simple as, hey, this is finally an opportunity for kids in the 80s now to see people who look like them and show them, hey, you can do this?
Yeah, absolutely. Representation is definitely very important. It's important for people to see people who look like them, as you said, excelling in a field and showing that it can be done. And it has to be more than just a handful of people. And the reason why women's wrestling kind of died out there for a while until Vince McMahon and Glow kind of revitalized it is because Billy Wolf died in the early 60s. He died in 63, I want to say. So that whole sex, muscles, and diamonds formula kind of went by the wayside. And the quality, as Jeff Lean, who wrote the biography of Mildred Burke, talks about this in the documentary, the quality of female wrestler kind of declined. It was more about flash and just being used as window dressing, whereas Billy Wolf was like, these women, yes, I want them to look like Hollywood starlets, but they're real athletes. So it takes someone like a Billy Wolf, unfortunately, it doesn't have to be a man, but it takes someone who has a degree of power to hire people. I mean, we see that in every industry. It takes people who have the power to hire and greenlight projects and stuff to make these stars that, of diverse races that young kids can look up to and say, hey, I can be like that. Like, I think it's great that The Rock has this new sitcom about his early days, because maybe somebody will see that and say, hey, that's a path I can take.
Well, it's interesting that you brought that up, because even going to Rocky Johnson, 1966, and it was Stu Hart in Canada who, I believe he helped train Rocky and started promoting him, and was like one of the first people to give Rocky Johnson a break. That's, you think about, that's not too long ago in the overall scope of things, to think of, here is someone who got an opportunity in Canada to get his start, even though he was from the States, and was still built up as a quote unquote Negro wrestler. He wasn't a wrestler. And for his kid to now be in this series, the premise is that it's The Rock looking back at his life in, I think, like 2034, when he's president of the United States, which is very possible.
Impossible.
Yeah. So, and how important was there any kind of thing you found out through, talking and reading? How important was Canada to actually giving opportunities to African American women?
Yeah, Canada was very, very important. Ethel talks about, she mentions how some of her earliest matches were in Montreal and different parts of Canada. So Canada was very, very important. I don't know if it's because Canada didn't have slavery and didn't have the history of Jim Crow that the United States had, that they were more open-minded, but Canada was definitely a training ground and a place where a lot of Black wrestlers found acceptance and found that they would be treated like stars when they went there. In fact, I got to interview Roddy Piper for the documentary, and he was Canadian, and he tells a story about when he and Ramona were at some bar and some guy was hitting on Ramona in French, Ramona not speaking French, he did, because he was Canadian, and he kind of stood up for Ramona. So that was kind of cool to learn from the women and from the male wrestlers themselves, that they were kind of like gentlemen outside of the ring. It wasn't a lot of, that I found out, that I heard of, a lot of sexual harassment between the male wrestlers and the women. It was like they were more like their big brothers and kind of protected them, which was, kind of cool to hear.
Was there, speaking of that, and knowing all these allegations and stories that came out about Moolah and the system that was run,
Yeah.
were there any recollections from any of the women of any type of that kind of harassment, or just generally, essentially making them do whatever it was that they wanted to, essentially get to make money off of these women without them having an opportunity to defend themselves, because there were no unions, obviously, and you were already in this country. Think about being a woman, let alone being a Black woman. It's like you almost had no advocate for you at all.
Yeah, I mean, when I saw the Vice News special, The Dark Side of the Ring on Moolah, I mean, my mind was blown because it sounded like, excuse my French, it sounded like she was basically pimping the women out. Like, so I remember Sweet Georgia Brown's children basically like saying my mother would go on these trips, wrestling trips, and then several months later she'd be pregnant. So it sounded like it was basically like sex trafficking. Now the women that I interviewed, granted, I didn't specifically ask them about that, and I don't know that they would have volunteered that, if that happened to them. But it sounded like for all of Billy Wolf's flaws, he definitely slept with some of the, I don't know about the Black women, but he definitely had affairs outside of his marriage to Mildred. And he even married, Nell Stewart, I think is her name. That ended up being one of his wives, who was also one of his wrestlers. So he had affairs with some of the wrestlers. But as far as I know, the Black women were not treated the way Moolah allegedly, I'll say that, for legal reasons, her wrestlers. I don't think they were being sent out and prostituted the way that Moolah has been accused of. I think the racism and the Jim Crow, because they were in they were Ethel and her era of women were really sort of like pre-civil rights. They were before like the Civil Rights Act was even signed into law. They were like in the 50s and early 60s. So they had enough to deal with dealing with the racism and the, being chased out of town by the Klan. I don't know that there would even been time to set up a underground sex ring on top of all the racism and stuff they were dealing with.
Speaking of that era and having, heard a lot of different stories from what went on in the minor leagues of baseball after they had just integrated, and minor league systems were pretty much, a lot of them were down in the South. Was there particular things when they were in the South that they had to do in terms of like hotels and that? Was there any kind of stories or indications on what that traveling system was like for them?
Yeah, there's a whole section of the documentary called The Other Side of the Game, which I got that title from the Erykah Badu song, but it's like the whole flip side of the game, the whole flip side of fame was because as I said, they were popular during the Jim Crow era. So it was like when they would go into a town. I actually interviewed Hassan Jeffries, who's a Ohio State University Black Studies professor. His brother just happens to be Hakeem Jeffries, who's in Congress. Anyway, he talks about that whole era of how, they called it the Chitlin circuit of any Black athlete or entertainer. You couldn't just go stay at the Hilton or the popular big hotel in town. You had to stay at Miss So-and-so's boarding house because the hotel didn't accept Black people. You couldn't go just stop at any roadside restaurant and walk in and get a hamburger. The women talk about this. Ethel and Ramona talk about having to go in the back door through the kitchen and place their order and pick their food up at the back door. This is in the United States of America, not that long ago, 50 or 60 some years ago when they were really young. Right. So yeah, they had to deal with all of that. Then they had to deal with that on top of the segregated shows, the doing two matches a day, one for the white audience and one for the Black audience. And a lot of times Billy Wolf and Mildred's son would drive the women to their matches. And they talk about being stopped by sheriffs, and they're like, what is this white man doing in the same car with these Black women? This is race mixing. And luckily they had some close calls, but luckily a lot of times the sheriff would just say, get out of town. I don't ever want to see you here again. They, because a lot worse could have happened. They could have taken them to some, backwoods place and shot all of them, and then never to be heard from again. So yeah, there was that racism and Jim Crow. That was a big part of, I think, why the women didn't want to talk about their experiences out when they weren't wrestling.
And okay, go ahead.
Really quick, just following up on that. Obviously, the North was, a little more accepting of the integration. The key question here, and I've never heard anything about this, even with the male wrestlers. Did you happen to stumble across anything that documented if either African-American women or even African-American men were able to wrestle at Madison Square Garden during that period?
I'm glad you asked that, because Madison Square Garden, Ethel actually says in one of the interviews we had, she said, my dream was to wrestle in Madison Square Garden, and we never got there because girls weren't allowed. So it wasn't a race thing. Believe it or not, liberal blue state New York banned women's wrestling. New York and California, which we think of as just the most liberal, coastal elite cities, banned women's wrestling. So Ethel never got to wrestle at Madison Square Garden, not because of her race necessarily, but because it was deemed indecent. Like women rolling around in bikinis was just deemed as indecent. So it was banned from Madison Square Garden, at least during when she was popular.
Wow. With Ethel and her sisters, as they were becoming more popular, other was there a growing amount of other women now beginning to join wrestling? They wanted to now be a part of this, and they started wrestling in the 60s or the late 50s or so.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I went to the University of Notre Dame, I just thought Ethel and her sisters, and then their childhood friend Ramona. I thought, okay, it was just these group of women who just kind of stumbled into this thing, and they're just kind of like unicorns or whatever.
Yeah.
But when I went to the University of Notre Dame, when I tell you there were bankers boxes and bankers boxes worth of photos, press clippings, dozens of women from all over the country. Not all of them were managed by Billy Wolf, of course, because some of them were in the South, like Sweet Georgia Brown. But there were dozens of women. Another woman who I did not get to interview, who's still living, who was one of the first Black women recruited by Billy Wolf, is Kathleen Wembley. She was married to Bobo Brazil, one of the big, famous African-American male wrestlers. And she has a whole other story because Kathleen did not want to just be pigeonholed as like a Black woman and sent on the Chitlin circuit. So Billy Wolf sent her on an entirely different circuit than he sent Ethel and her sister. So there were dozens of women. I mean, every now and then somebody will send me a Facebook message and say, "Hey, my mom was a wrestler recruited by Billy Wolf. I know you didn't intentionally overlook her, but she was part of Billy Wolf's organization too. She was one of his Black women wrestlers." So there were dozens of these women. And so once Ethel and her sisters got in, Billy Wolf just began, like I said, he had a lot of flaws, but he definitely had an open door policy when it came to race.
That's interesting that you said that, family members, have reached out to you. And just thinking about it in these terms, I think this is a fairly easy comparison for those people who kind of don't understand what it was like back then. And basically, think of a league of their own.
Yes.
And that's what these women were to, the wrestling world. And you brought up I think Sweet Georgia Brown to me is probably like if there was any mainstream African American name that I think that historians might gravitate, it's her, because she's had that history. Did you take a step in finding out if any of that generation influenced people like Jazz or Jacqueline, some of the women who were in, let's say, their, I don't want to, like, 30s, I don't want to insult anyone, but around their their 30s, late 20s, in the 90s, that might have been influenced by either stories of, through the way stories get passed on about that generation, because that's same thing about League of Their Own. That was only a something that was encapsulated by those people who got to see it firsthand. There was very little footage of it, and then the only thing that happens is word of mouth through the years that hopefully inspires a younger generation to be able to achieve and do as those people did. Were there any connections that you saw that led to some of the more popular or more mainstream wrestlers of the past 20-30 years?
Yeah, man, my perception is that no, there's not. I think it was a lot of the younger African American wrestlers would not know who Ethel Johnson was, would not know who Babs Wingo was. some of the younger wrestlers that I've talked to, they were just as amazed as I was when I found out about these women. And like, oh my God, there was Black women wrestlers back in the 50s. And it's because of the history of these women being underground for so long. So like you said, it was very similar to A League of Their Own, where women's baseball, it was witnessed by the crowd who happened to be in the stands at the time. It wasn't well archived or well documented. So it wasn't passed down from generation to generation. So it wasn't like how a young Black kid in the inner city could look to Jackie Robinson and say, I learned about Jackie Robinson during Black History Month. Or I grew up watching Michael Jordan play basketball. That's how I got inspired by it. My sense is that these women, some partly by choice, their history was just kind of almost totally erased. So they weren't really a big influence on the modern women of today, because like you said, there's not a lot of footage that a modern young Black woman wrestler can go look at of Ethel Johnson or of even Sweet Georgia Brown to say, okay, here's how I can, pattern myself after her. The most they can do is look at their old publicity photos.
So yeah, I'm glad you said publicity photos, because my next question was, for you as a filmmaker dealing with documentary that doesn't have a lot of that stuff, how hard was it to find elements that you could use? And then was it a lot of Ken Burnsing it in terms of using the techniques of the camera and the fade ins and the pullouts to kind of give that imagination and somewhat of a life to just photos? And how hard was it to come by actual recorded images, either film or video?
Yeah, the film or video was very hard to come by. I did find a couple clips of, actually one clip of, I think it's all three sisters, Ethel, Babs, and Marva in the ring together. And I did have I interviewed Marva's daughter, Kim, and she had some footage of her mom from I think the 70s. So there wasn't a lot of actual footage, but as far as photos, the University of Notre Dame was like a treasure trove. I mean, there were so many photos and press clippings that I didn't even use all of them in the movie. So the University of Notre Dame, there was a wrestling promoter named Jack Pfeffer who donated his archives to the University of Notre Dame. I call him an organized pack rat because he saved everything. I'm talking about like newspaper ads, letters back and forth between him and the women. I found a letter that Ramona Isbell had written him saying, for my match next week, I need this, this, and this. It was like her writer, like, I need my green M&Ms in my dressing room and my this, that, and the other. So I found a lot of actual like still photos, but not actual footage.
I mean, so there are truly hidden figures.
Yes.
And just like in the movie, because I didn't know,
I didn't either.
I saw that movie either. Eventually, it, through that information, things were done right. I believe I forgot her name. Got a Medal of Honor from President
Catherine. Yeah, I can't remember her last name, but yeah.
So,
Catherine.
how do we do the same for these sisters, or Ethel Johnson, who definitely needs to have that moment? Yeah, I mean, how does one go about that? And I know you were talking about how it's tough, especially, the idea of what people think of wrestling. But I mean, wrestling is becoming more popular, and not just more popular with the women's wrestling. It's becoming, I mean, they're more superb in some cases than the men. So what do we need to do to make this happen?
Yeah, I think it starts at the local level here in Ohio. And I have to admit, I mean, I've been so busy like trying to get the documentary released and trying to promote it that I haven't done the work of the stuff that needs to happen to commemorate the women locally. Like I've nominated them for a couple of like Women's Hall of Fame and never heard back about it, like the Ohio Women's Hall of Fame. Actually, there's a local history organization called the Ohio History Connection that did record Ramona's oral history, and they requested that Ethel participate as well. Ethel passed away in September of 2018, unfortunately. And earlier that year, the Ohio History Connection kept calling me and saying, we would love to have, we can send a camera crew out to Ethel's house. She doesn't even have to come into the studio to record her oral history. And she kept saying, you know, I maybe next month, I'm just not feeling up to it. And then, you know, a couple months later, she ended up passing away. So there has been a little bit of interest locally, but it would start with, I want to say like someone, I don't know if it needs to be me or one of the women's family members, or just a passionate wrestling advocate, or a historian, or a professor who believes in documenting history, really needs to lobby Columbus City Council. We need a street named after Ethel Johnson or the Wingo sisters. We need a statue in front of there's this Black organization called the Martin Luther King Arts Complex. We need a statue of Ethel in front of the Martin Luther King complex. Right. Here's the artist, here's how much it will cost. Let's write a grant and get it done. Somebody needs to make that their full-time job. Unfortunately, I'm so busy trying to promote the documentary. That takes a lot of work. You have to follow up with people. Our congressional representative, Joyce Beatty, is a Black woman. I believe she would be open to this, but you can't just email Joyce Beatty once and say, okay, she didn't get back to me, so forget about it. You have to contact her assistants. You have to show up at her events and, you know, pull her aside after she gets through with her town hall and say, we need a statue of Ethel Johnson. We need to commemorate the Wingo sisters. We need to, you know, so it really needs to start at the local level before we even think of something like the presidential Medal of Freedom or whatever. Of course. If it starts at the local level, then it will be easier to get someone like Kamala Harris to say, hey, look, this woman, Ethel Johnson, has just been inducted into the Ohio Women's Hall of Fame, and they just named a street after her in the capital city, Columbus. Right. Would you consider, you know, lobbying Joe Biden on her behalf for a posthumous Medal of Freedom, or even the Kennedy Center honors or something like that? So it really needs to start locally, and maybe that's the next leg of this journey that I'm on, is trying to, because I've talked to their family, I've talked to Ethel's family members, and they're all for it, but it takes somebody taking the lead and really, I mean, you just have to be tireless. You have to be like a dog with a bone, just not give it up, because these politicians are not going to respond to you the first time. And, you know, they put their walls up so you can't get to them directly a lot of times. Right. So, yeah, it's going to take someone who's very persistent.
I guess we'll just have to, the three of us, just march into the Capitol and...
Don't say march to the Capitol. We've been through that.
Oh, man.
But point well taken. I know what you mean.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, with that being said, and I think that, you know, this is the first time I really thought about that when you said it in this terms, and that is, it's interesting to me that, like you said, there wasn't really an influence on the generation of wrestlers in the past 30 years because there wasn't a lot of documentation, a lot of stuff available. And on top of that, it doesn't seem that, especially that you said, you know, up to the certain point, New York wasn't allowing women to wrestle, that even Vince McMahon and anyone associated with the WWE has a grasp, because they didn't, you know, Vince's dad and grandfather never worked with, you know, this whole group of wrestlers that it's like, the unfortunate thing about Vince McMahon and the WWE is it got so big that the history of wrestling now is controlled by what they deem as historical.
Right.
Is there any way of opening their eyes to at least the thing they're doing now is, you know, if they don't put them on the big stage in the Hall of Fame with, you know, 5, 6, 7 people that they're putting in, they're doing that subcategory of, you know, wrestlers who are in the Hall of Fame, but never got the, you know, huge ceremony. Someone like a Haystacks Calhoun was put in like 2 years ago on this new thing that they started. Is there any way that, you know, like you said, I mean, it takes a lot to petition politicians, obviously. Is there any way the fans and, you know, guys like us, using this show, can make that step of trying to make the WWE realize, hey, acknowledge them, or even any of the, like the Cauliflower Alley Club, I don't think has really put any venture into the story of the African American wrestlers who are females from that era, and they deal with people who were pro wrestlers, especially starting from the golden age of the 1950s on. So is there something that we can actively do as fans that can bring awareness and hopefully get some inductions so that that part of the history is not totally wiped out?
Yes, absolutely. And so that's the good thing about social media. I mean, there's a lot of downsides to social media, but if a fan started some kind of petition to get, let's just say, Ethel inducted into the WWE, into a Hall of Fame or recognized by the WWE, and it got I'm talking about thousands and thousands and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of signatures, yes, the WWE would sit up and take notice of that. So yes, a fan initiated petition drive or some kind of social media push would absolutely get the powers that be at the WWE and everywhere else that recognizes wrestlers. They would definitely sit up and take notice. And the WWE is not completely unaware of these women, because they made a video game and had Marva Scott, Ethel's younger sister, as one of the characters. So to my knowledge, now I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here, but to my knowledge, none of Marva's descendants have been financially rewarded for that. So they're part of the reluctance on the family is that, okay, they want to know, is this going to just be something where my mother's image is exploited, and just used as, oh, look, we're woke because we're recognizing a Black woman and we don't get anything out of it financially, or all we get out of it is a pat on the back and saying, oh, your mom was cool.
Right.
So there's financial issues that have to be kind of worked out, and there's maybe in the past people have approached the family and said, oh, I'd like to do this, that, or the other, and they're like, she was already underpaid in her lifetime. Why should we just do something and not get any financial reward? It reminds me of Henrietta Lacks, the Black woman whose cells were used to develop all these different medicines. Her family has never benefited from any of that. It's great for humanity, but her family, should not be destitute when their mother's cells are being used to develop all these medical treatments. So I think there rightfully is maybe some reluctance on the part of the descendants of these women that we don't want to just do something for the sake of show. We want something that's going to, we want people to put their money where their mouth is. Now, that's not to say that they wouldn't support, like a statue being put up or the women being inducted into the halls of fame. But I don't think they would want a huge organization like the WWE to do something for their, their mothers and not have any kind of financial reward attached to it. Because I'm sure The Rock is being compensated handsomely for that sitcom. He's not doing that just to be altruistic so he can inspire young people. It's a business venture.
Right.
Well, at this point, The Rock could basically do it for nothing and just,
but he wouldn't. So.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, Chris. This is for a little fun now. Do you watch the current product, WWE, AEW, any of the wrestling organizations today?
Yeah, I watch it here and there, and I listen to different wrestling podcasts, and I watch different wrestling commentators on YouTube, but I can't say that I really keep my finger on the pulse of it. And it's interesting you asked that, because when I finished a cut of the documentary back in I think it was 2017, I realized I had never been to a wrestling match in person. I was a big wrestling fan when I was like in middle school, like when the WWF was popular and Roddy Piper and Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair and all those guys were popular. I watched it all the time and would in fact throw myself around like imitating their moves and stuff. And then I kind of outgrew it. So wrestling was the furthest thing from my mind when I met Ethel Johnson through man named Terry Johnson, a Black man who works as a publicist, and recommended that I interview her. So it was just interesting to me going to this. I went to WrestleCon in Orlando, and it was just interesting to me to see how passionate male wrestling fans were to watch women's wrestling. Because I can't, and I've said this before, I cannot imagine any other sport where women are the athletes and men are these passionate fans. I can't imagine a football stadium full of men going to watch women play football. I can't even imagine ladies golf having a whole bunch of rabid male fans wanting to run up and take selfies and, you know, root them on while they're while they're doing their golf swings. I just think wrestling is unique in that way, where wrestling fans don't seem to care about the gender of the wrestler as long as they can deliver in the ring.
Yeah.
Which is interesting that you say that, because it's taken so long. Like I said, when Vince was starting the run in the 80s, Wendy Richter got a lot of popularity. And then she had a falling out with Vince. Vince had Moolah screw her. Moolah was the champ again. And it essentially killed women's wrestling outside of Glow, which was popular. And then Glow, ran its course of, 3 years of popularity, and then it went away. And there was a struggle. And even into the Attitude Era of, the early 2000s, you started to see women's wrestling getting popular. But a lot of what they were still doing at that time was this TNA booking, let's put them in skimpy clothes. Let's have these kind of goofy, misogynistic type matches to win the audience that they have now. It's taken a lot of that journey to have them establish themselves as the athletes that they are now, where you have that, it's apples or oranges, like DJ said. Some of the women are better than some of the men athletically in the ring. And I think back in the 50s, it was essentially that same type of concept. I think the fans appreciated it because where else did you get to see women, especially back then? You didn't have them when World War II ended, the baseball league dissolved. So there was no, women professional leagues in baseball. There was no women basketball leagues, no women football leagues. We almost were essentially doctrinated to see women in that light of, oh, well, they're not as, athletically gifted as men are. And it's fascinating to see this evolution. When you talk to some of the family members or some of the wrestlers from that time period, did they have any perception on maybe not, where wrestling in a sense is, but where women have come from that time to where we are now in a society where women can be accepted as, equal in terms of athletic ability?
Yeah, I think this is an ongoing systemic issue in society at large. Unfortunately, the women that I interviewed, Ethel Johnson, Ethel Brown, and Ramona Isbell, who all wrestled in that era of the 50s, all said that they didn't really follow modern wrestling that much. And Ramona even said, she was like, I couldn't name some popular Black women wrestlers for you. She was like, maybe they're out there, I don't know who they are. And she said she was put off by modern women's wrestling because she felt, like you said, she felt like it was TNA. I mean, they wore sexy costumes, but it wasn't, like I said, they had to be real athletes.
Right.
So unfortunately, they don't see the modern wrestling industry as like, oh, women have made these great strides and it was all because of us. They don't see it that way at all. They see it as we were real athletes, and nowadays it's just all about flash. And unfortunately, that's a systemic problem. If you look at any study of the movie industry, how many female directors are there? There's been one female director, Catherine Bigelow, well, two, I guess, Sophia Coppola, who've ever won, a Best Picture Oscar for directing. And I'm talking about every year, year after year, it's the same thing. How many female musicians are there who play instruments? who are not dance divas, who are not, you know, the Britney Spears. You know, that you might see them, you might see Lady Gaga get on the piano every now and then, but except for older women like, you know, Sheila E. or Bonnie Raitt or Sheryl Crow, how many female instrumentalists who are top superstars do you see? How many female athletes in other sports do you see? Women's basketball or women's football, if such a thing, you know, was popular. Do you see that being broadcast all the time the way men's sports? Could you sit down on a Sunday afternoon and find tons of games featuring all women athletes and their household names like LeBron James? It's a systemic problem, unfortunately. So maybe with the Me Too movement and the you know, the racial reckoning that's been going on since George Floyd's death, that Black women will start making more strides in all areas. But it's unfortunately this problem of women being perceived as capable in certain areas. It just seems like, you know, society takes two steps forward and 2 steps back. You have women like Ethel who became popular, then they faded away. Then, like you said, Glow came out and, you know, became popular again for a while. Then it sort of waxes and wanes. It's not as, you know, it's not a steady march toward progress, unfortunately.
And hopefully that will change. You know, I mean, I can have hope. I mean, the good thing about Bianca Belair, who just won the Women's Royal Rumble, who will have a title shot for the Women's Championship, is an athlete, you know, who shows her strength and ability. And yes, she is a beautiful woman as well. But it's all about just how she, you know, her techniques that she used in the ring, which are just amazing to watch. And if they can kind of stick to that going forward, and you never know, you know, from what we've seen, you know, it can easily go back to the other way. But, you know, we all know it's all about money as well. So whatever that dictates is to where they're going to go. But at least with her, it seems like that's a good start that I like to see. But I also think it's important for people like a Bianca Belair, or I even say Sasha Banks or whoever, to also know who Ethel Johnson is as well, to know that they did exist. Because, you know, you have someone like Sasha, which I believe she's, her role model was Eddie Guerrero, which that's a good one because I love Eddie as well. So I understand exactly where she's coming from, but I don't know, and Matt, you may know a little bit more than I do. Are there women who say they're mentors, they name other women that's the reason why they got into the business versus them naming more of the men that they watch to get in there? I mean, could you say, because I know you pay a little bit more attention to that than I do.
You
Yeah,
know,
no, right?
that's a tough question because really the erasing of, or I don't want to even say erasing, but the fact that there wasn't a way to preserve and, you know, move on. Like the problem is that when you have one company who really takes control of the narrative of history,
Sure. Right.
then you're at the mercy of what they've put out there. And so
Right.
you see some of the women talk about maybe a Trish Stratus or Alita
Right.
as being, you know, role models, but it's really hard to go back to anyone prior to, you know, 1999, 2000,
Right.
because there just isn't enough. And this is one of the reasons I think Chris's film is so important for people to watch.
Right.
Not only watch, but please, I'm going to encourage you, because it's on Amazon, review it, because the more reviews the film gets, it's going to go to the front of the Amazon suggestions for people. And that's going to be huge, because the more we can get that out there to where people are exposed to this, then people are going to get hungry for more knowledge on it. And that's how we keep everyone's memories alive and the true history alive. Because, you know, we're looking at three guys here who basically in 30 years, if we haven't, expressed that history to the kids who will have a couple generations in the next 30 years, there's a chance that that generation, which will approach that 100 years since,
Mhm.
will almost be forgotten. And that's the thing we can't let happen.
Right.
Yeah. And I would love to have Bianca Belair or Sasha Banks,
Mhm.
endorse Lady Wrestler just for the sheer, to bring more awareness to it, but also for them, like you said,
Right.
so they would know about these women like Ethel Johnson. But that gets back to, the gatekeeper question. Do I tag Sasha Banks and Bianca Belair in my social media post? How do they know I'm not just some crackpot?
Sure.
They're not. Do they have a team who will sit and look at my, interviews I've done like this and say, okay, he's a legit guy. He's not some stalker who's just trying to get, Bianca Belair's phone number or whatever.
Sure. Mhm.
Well, I think you just said a very, very key thing, and that is, if it's just you approaching it, that will be difficult. But even our listenership, our viewership, please, if you go ahead and watch the film and you enjoy what you're seeing and you think that this is important, please tag Sasha, tag Bianca,
Mhm.
tag all these talented, one person we keep, we say Sasha and Bianca a lot, but Naomi
Yes.
is very, very important. And I think, damn, through the through the realm of the scope, when you're talking about forgetting about history and wrestlers, that's an instance of a name that we as an audience have effectively forgotten already. And she's still active and still really good.
Sure.
That's how quick you can forget about things. So I think if anyone watching sees the movie, enjoys it, and feels as passionate as we do about it, tag them. And
Right.
the more people who tag them, the more legitimate it becomes. It's not just one person stalking, it's a movement of people going, hey, there's a history here. And damn straight that a person like Sasha, or a person like Bianca, or a person like Naomi, they will take the time to watch it if it catches their attention, because I think they are as passionate
Mhm.
about this as anyone else.
Yep.
They just don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, thanks for saying that, because there's strength in numbers, and wrestling is definitely one of those industries that's driven by the fans. So if there was some kind of
Mhm.
movement, or just a lot of fans saying, "Hey, you need to take a look at this," and that would be a critical mass to get the attention of someone like Naomi or
Yeah.
Sasha or Bianca, definitely.
And as we, wrap up, I want to also just remind that the title of it is Lady Wrestler, the amazing untold story of African American women in the ring. Look, we're gonna definitely be pushing this on our social media as well. So for everyone, yes, for everyone who's listening, and you feel you're not in a position at right now to remember what it is, you know how to get to our social media. It's going to be on there forever, because everything you put on the internet stays forever. So we're going to link all that information there for you to be able to access that. And yes, please watch it. It's great. And Chris Bournae, what's next for you, now that you have made this huge accomplishment?
Thank you. Yeah. Well, again, I appreciate you guys' support. I actually filmed a fictional movie, a narrative movie,
Mhm.
in the summer of 2019. And so that's my next project, is editing that and getting it released. And I promise you, I did not have a crystal ball when I made this movie. So it's about a Black family
Mhm.
struggling through an economic crisis. They both get laid off. They have to pull their kids out of private school and homeschool them online. And they're home all day getting on each other's nerves. It's called Things Are Tough All Over. Like I said, I had no idea when I shot this in 2019 that it would be relevant to the times we're living in now. So that's my next project.
Okay, man. This has been awesome, man. I thank you for coming on. I've learned so much. I believe our listeners learned a lot as well. And we're gonna put some action in this, because we know action is important. And so we're gonna move forward, and we're gonna see what comes out of it. And because it's important that Ethel Johnson and her sisters, they get that recognition. And so, yeah.
Thank you, Matt and DJ Impact. And I can definitely speak on behalf of the families. They really appreciate all that you guys are doing to get the word out. They really want their mother's legacy to be remembered. Like you said, Matt, we can't forget about people. They really want them to be remembered. So this is a big step in helping that come about.
That is awesome. All right. Well, with that, everyone, thank you for listening. Don't forget, it's Lady Wrestler, the amazing untold story of African-American women in the ring. It's on Amazon Prime Video right now. And with that, we'll see you next time. Take care.